warm welcome here to the DGAP. My name is Johannes Lindner. I'm co-director of the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. And we want to discuss with you and my panelists here today the topic of enlargement and institutional reform. And we're doing this in parallel to the heads of state and of government in Granada, where the informal European Council is taking place as we speak. Starting point for our discussion is the Group of 12 report, as it's now being called. And this is a report of the German and French experts that were mandated by the European ministers Anna Lührmann and Laurence Boone to look into the question of institutional reform with a focus on enlargement. And this is the starting point for us, and we want to zoom in on two specific aspects in that respect. One is how has been the reception and how is the debate on institutional reform taking place in Central and Eastern Europe, and how is the link made to enlargement? So a specific focus on enlargement in our debate here, and a specific focus on Central and Eastern Europe. And as I said, I'm very glad to have a very nice set of panelists here. First of all, I have the rapporteur of the group, or the German rapporteur of the group, Professor Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, here to my right. She's from the board of the Bertelsmann Foundation and also a former director of the DGAP. So a bit of homecoming to you for being here. Then I have Konrad Szymański to my left. He's the deputy director of the Polish Institute for a Polish Economic Institute, and he was from 2020 to 22 minister for the EU, and before, with a very similar portfolio, deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs. So he's one of the longest-serving members of the General Affairs Council and very much a formative voice on European politics in Poland. And I'm very glad that you've accepted to come here. And you were a member of the European Parliament before, sure, from 2004 to 2014. So you also have the Brussels experience that you bring in. Then I turn to Milan Nič. Milan Nič is here, senior, and I realized too, forgive me that I didn't do ladies first, so I should have done the ladies first. But okay, we have Milan Nič. Milan, you're a senior research fellow here at the DGAP at the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe and Russia and Central Asia. And I would like to thank you because you were one of the driving forces to bring us all here at the DGAP and to say we need to have that focus on Central Eastern Europe in the debate and picking up on some of the discussions that anyway you had in the group already, but I think this was a congenial idea of bringing us here. And then finally, further from the group of 12, I'm glad to welcome Dr. Nguyen, who's senior fellow at the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin, and senior research fellow here at the DGAP, Shahin Vallée, also one of the co-authors of the report. So with this great panel, I would like to start and give the floor to Daniela. Maybe you could set the scene and explain a little bit about the genesis of the report and also how you in the group took on the mandate that you were given and how you see the link between enlargement and institutional reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for your kind introduction, for hosting the discussion today, and thank you for DGAP for having us. It's always great. Coming home is a great thing to do, so it's nice to be here. The report came about because we have two rather foresighted ministers in France and Germany, the Europe ministers, who decided around the end of last year, just before the end of last year, to bring together a group of experts to work on the question how the European Union can prepare for enlargement. I'm really emphasizing that this was pretty early, although, of course, the discussion on enlargement was already ongoing because Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, had already filed their application as a candidate state. And we, of course, have ongoing negotiations with the Western Balkan countries for years. But at that time, I don't think there was a consensus at all in the General Affairs Council that there should be a political push to bring forward a really big debate, well, a debate on the big questions of the future of Europe, and it's nothing but that. We are now in the middle of a discussion about the size of the European Union, 27 plus, how many, we'll see. But also about the question whether there should be an institutional reform, maybe even a treaty reform. So the big questions are back at a time where some governments, frankly, don't really want to have those questions back because they seem complicated. Treaty reform is risky. There can be ratification failure. There can be dissensus. There can be complicated procedures, a convention maybe. So it was a real political push, this initiative that the two ministers from France and Germany took. Now, we got a mandate which was published on the anniversary of the Élysée Treaty, or the next day, to be very precise, on January 23rd this year. And we as a group then really had to work out what we actually do. If you read the mandate, you will see it's about enlargement readiness, it's about institutional reform. There's a remark on continuity to the conferences on the future of Europe. So we sat down and said, first of all, we have to look at the whole panorama of questions that we think are important, and then focus and structure so it becomes workable. Because the 12 of us are all in other jobs. This was, a low to no budget exercise for people who are busy in in other responsibilities. We came up with the idea to say any reform we suggest should feed into at least one, if not more, of three goals. One is, of course, enlargement readiness. That's why we came together. The second one, and this is one of the most crucial topics in the report, is they should help strengthen the rule of law and democracy in the European Union. And the third one is capacity to act, so efficiency in decision-making, ability to make decisions, so actually to put the EU, even if it has more members, in a better situation than it is today to pursue its own goals, to take policy decisions, to be able to implement. Now, I already said that the rule of law is a key issue, and I will pick that up as an example to illustrate how we think about enlargement and reform of the EU together, and I know Tu will come to the substance of what we then put forward. For us, enlarging the European Union and reforming the European Union are not separable. So we say the EU as it is today has weaknesses which we know. The system works and produces things, but we think it can do better. And if it grows, it needs to do better in any case because of the sheer numbers, because of the growing challenges within, with more diverse positions, conflicts of interest, of course, more complexity to handle. It needs to review many things, including the budget, and Shahin will speak about that in a moment. Now, rule of law is so essential because this is maybe the one topic where we are worried that if the EU enlarges too quickly, both for itself, but also for candidate states that haven't had the chance to really transform themselves, this may be one of the features of the EU that can be undermined. We as a group agreed that this is one of the non-negotiable principles of the European Union. And why? Because it is a principle that only makes the single market possible, and so much is built on that. Tu will come to that, so I won't say more at this point. But our fundamental recognition is we want a strong EU which can also reach out to its neighborhood in a more powerful way, which can be an international actor, and we start actually with a geopolitical analysis. what the world around us represents today and why enlargement is so important. But it needs to be internally absolutely firm. And that starts with rule of law and its fundamental values, and it continues with the capacity of the system to deliver to citizens in an efficient and transparent way. I'll leave it there because we're so many on the panel, but I'm happy to come back in later.
Konrad, do you want to pick it up from there and bring in your views both on the institutional reform debate as well as the link to enlargement?
Thank you for an invitation. Of course, I would like to start with most general context and functionality of the report. I read it very carefully, and what strikes me most is the fact that the report, the whole construction, is based on assumption that EU is not ready yet to welcome new members. It's a quotation from the beginning of the report. And this is the foundation of the whole spirit of this proposal, and sometimes even alarmist tone. And I think that this assumption is simply wrong. Of course, we have in every single capital, we have a list of complaints to Brussels. Warsaw, I think, is still a leader. And many things could be done better, many things could be done faster, on time, and we all know that our solutions are best and they are not fully represented in this common approach of the EU, but we should be careful with this sort of narrative promoting the quite revolutionary package of reform, because a side effect could be rather negative, and also in general opinion. I think we can be even positively surprised that with pandemia, with post-COVID reconstruction, with Ukraine, which is most important, this is multi-layered question of financial support for Ukrainian state, humanitarian aspect, also military assistance, which is unprecedented. And I'm not talking only about the most important thing, which is an assistance provided by member states, but also provided by the European Union under the European peace instrument. So we shouldn't be so negative. To conclude this aspect, I would like to remind you a very important part of the State of the Union by Ursula von der Leyen. A couple of weeks before in the European Parliament, she said that the good news is that with every enlargement, those who said it would make us less efficient were proven wrong. Take the last few years. We agreed on next generation EU at 27. We agreed to buy vaccines at 27. We agreed on sanctions in record time, also at 27. We agreed to purchase natural gas, not only at 27, but including Ukraine, Moldova, and Serbia. So it can be done. End of quotation. I think it's much more pragmatic, let's say, and rational approach to the problem, what sort of union we have. Of course, it is an imperfect union. Of course, especially we in Warsaw, we have a list of complaints. We would like to see it better. But strong conditionality between enlargement and reform is simply wrong. Of course, we need an adaptation, and this is a huge thing. A policy adaptation promised by European Commission, a budgetary adaptation. It's a huge challenge vis-à-vis member states, having in mind our fiscal limitations in all capitals. Different sort, different nature, but in the end we have very strong fiscal limitations in the Union, and it's a good question how to do it in case of Ukraine. But in this process, adaptation and enlargement, we need to find a ground for better ownership of the process by member states. We need to secure the control over the process. Otherwise, with, for example, a huge proposal to transform union into QMV machine, we will make this organism, this machinery, less controllable by member states, which means that the ownership and fears, and in the end, decreasing trust to the whole process, will destroy this organization. And it's the easiest way to do is to block anything you can ratify. And in case of budget, in case of enlargement, we will need extraordinary ratification process, politically very, very sensitive. So I would put attention to solutions which would secure the political process and the role of member states, every single member state in the process. QMV is, of course, the shortest way to inflame fears and, in the end, opposition, sometimes, usually, to be honest, unproportional. But anyway, it is strong. We have already a lot of experience here. Treaty change isn't a taboo for Poland. Poland was one of the first countries who said that, yes, we should be serious about the way union works. But probably we would propose different list of problems. First of all, it's a legal certainty. I will be able to talk about it in the perspective of rule of law. The second problem is a political balance in the Council. You mentioned this, and I'm very grateful that you proposed that we should change the threshold for double majority, but it's much more fundamental, because the Lisbon Treaty was designed for the union which is enlarging. And it happened that this is the union which is shrinking after Brexit. So we lost already a balance, internal balance in the union, and we landed. This is not intentional. I don't want to blame anybody here. Brexit is the main reason. We landed in a situation where Germany and France can block almost anything in the Council, and the rest of the countries are definitely weaker in such a situation where the important national interest should be defended this way. That's the logic of the double majority today, without Great Britain around the table. The second horizontal observation is a problem of strongest possible, and we heard it today again, conditionality between reform and enlargement. To be honest, it looks like a good excuse to stop the process. If we really establish the conditionality like this, we will produce an artificial pretext not to enlarge in the end. To be honest, as we did it in the case of Lisbon, I think we should be serious about reform, but we should do it together with Ukraine. As we did it, Lisbon, together with Central Europe. It is not totally fair when we try to intensify our efforts to change the union dramatically, to be honest, because if you would apply all your recommendations, the union would be a totally different organization, just the day before Ukraine will join. I think it is not a declaration of goodwill. I think we should be careful with the language we use in this case. In this context, I would like to remind you another quotation from Ursula von der Leyen, which is not probably a natural thing in Poland, but I think it's useful here. She said during the same State of the Union quotation, "And I will always support this House and all of those who want to reform the EU to make it work better for citizens. And yes, that means including through a European Convention and treaty change if and where it is needed. But we cannot and we should not wait for treaty change to move ahead with enlargement. A union fit to enlargement can be achieved faster." I couldn't agree more with this perspective. The moderator asked me to say a couple of words about the rule of law question in the second round, so I think it would be good to stick to this to this model of the debate. Let me say at the very end one thing about QMV as a method, if I still have a time. Because this is quite conventional, to be honest. It's not intellectually very new, that we used to believe that the problems we have with the decision-making in the Union, which is, of course, unprecedented, intensified international organization, probably something more today, that the old problems we have, political problems, political limitations in the Council, will be cancelled with a sort of magic wand of QMV. QMV as a magic wand of European integration. I think the world is a little bit more complex, and I think we shouldn't trust that such a simple thing, the one solution for all problems we have could work. Efficiency is, of course, on the side of QMV, that's for sure. But we know very well from our democratic experience that efficiency isn't the only thing we can use as a criteria for public governance. Otherwise, we would be China 2.0 in Europe, as after pandemic. We remember that a lot of comments that democracy is fine, but we still wait for decisions because we have to consult, check and balance, and so on. But I think it's a beauty of democracy, and we shouldn't abandon this aspect, that efficiency is not everything. We have quite opposite problem in the Union. The problem is ownership, legitimacy, participation, a feeling, at least subjective feeling of control of the process. Feeling of no control brings us problem to the European Union. Whatever we think, there are different cases. Sometimes totally unproportional, sometimes well-motivated, but this feeling is destructive for international cooperation in nature. Look at this from liberal perspective. Dictative majority isn't the solution. Check and balance is an important part of our way of governance. Practically, with QMV, we would invite Putin to Brussels a couple of weeks before the war. That was the intention of Berlin and Paris. We used the veto power to stop this idea, and in the end, I think, as a union, we landed in a better situation, in better position. We would be in trouble probably with Putin in Brussels, as we been approached by at least two capitals. And why the reflection to the very end? We live in a world of unprecedented connectivity. It creates resilience, it creates our strength, but after Mark Leonard, author, director, and author of Age of Peace, probably the book is known in Germany. I don't know if it's translated to Germany. Mm-hmm. After Mark Leonard, we know that connectivity also leads to disappointments, envy, unpeace, and even hostility. That hyperconnectivity can endanger the whole system this way, as a side effect of the world we live in, where, in fact, the codependency is so intensive and sometimes not well understood by the people. To protect interconnected world, we need a different sort of recalibration, more control and more predictability, not just efficiency of the decision-making process. This is not the only value we have. Also quality is important. Make decision easier means that we can also adopt easier a wrong decision. And we should remember about it, because this is the very nature of the check and balance principle. And I fully subscribe to this principle because it creates security of the whole system. So I'm not definitely in favor of this way of thinking, not because of the fear that Poland will be outvoted one day. No, that's a selected aspect, but because of the fact that I believe that QMV-based European Union is a union where it's really easy to alienate and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 member states. And in the end, we are on the road of disintegration. And this is something wrong for Europe. I believe that we should find a way how to reintegrate the Union, and QMV isn't a solution. I will talk about rule of law, specific question with specific perspective and experience later.
Very good. And thank you for a very strong introductory statement, which I think gives us a lot of material to discuss further. We will also come to the QMV in the part where Shahin takes the floor. But I want, before going into that debate, give Milan the chance to add to the previous, to Konrad's statement, your view on the report, and maybe with the sort of specific Eastern and Central European perspective.
Thank you, Johannes. I will try my best, and I will do something else than I prepared, because we are already late. So I will try to add some points to quite comprehensive sort of mapping also to the horizon that Konrad did, and then come back to some of the points, including the process of the report and what should come next in maybe second round. Yeah. So let me start by expressing that I really believe in inclusiveness of these debates about the future of the EU. I think that's why we are here. My goal today is test the waters. I am really grateful to Konrad Szymański that he not only came to the DGAP today, but that he's willing to engage in a very sort of pragmatic, factual-based, sort of intellectual debate on the future of the EU at the time when in his own country is election campaign with a very strong anti-German tone. And I think it shows that election campaigns come and go, but this debate stays with us. It's fundamental, and we are all together in this. This is our European Union. And I'm saying this also as a Slovak in the DGAP, because my own country had a very divisive electoral campaign, and some of the discussions I had with high-level officials are private discussions because they are holding on with putting anything to paper because they don't know what kind of government they will have in Bratislava in a few weeks. So what I did to prepare for this panel is that I had phone calls with officials from 3 Central Eastern European countries, Slovakia, Lithuania, and Czech Republic. So 2 Eurozone countries and 1 recent EU presidency. And I want to say that although I tried to find some commonalities, the eastern part of European Union is not a monolith. It has a lot of diversity and diverging positions, almost like the whole of EU. In a similar way as would not be fair to say about something about the south of the EU. So bear this in mind. And I think it's also fair to say, I don't think this is an overstatement to say that in the east of EU, in the region, you have one exception, which is Hungary. Hungarian positions, I think, differ also from Polish positions in some important ways. So if I go through the list of some sort of open issues, enlargement and reform. Should EU first reform to enlarge? I think what I heard was less priority on reform, to the point of actually we don't need to reform to enlarge. We can enlarge in the present system. We need to adapt. Because institutional reform could take a lot of time, it's risky. So basically, one official, I think this time was from Prague, said enlargement for us is more important than institutional reform. My footnote to this is that there is a contradiction, because these governments and these officials are aware that the accession procedure, as it is now, allows blockages through unanimity. You have unanimity at too many levels. So you have Bulgarian veto of North Macedonia. I don't know what veto you will have next. If Serbia would have been more advanced, maybe Croatian veto there. Not to touch anybody's sensitivities, but we will not enlarge without QMV or some reform of the procedure in the accession process, is my personal or expert opinion. I would just sort of put it into brackets. Second topic, qualified majority vote, especially in foreign policy. A very sensitive issue, and it's, some governments say clearly no. Some governments are more open. So what I heard in Bratislava before the elections was constructive skepticism. We are open to discuss some areas to test, like human rights resolutions, maybe even sanctions. Other governments that I talked to are, however, skeptical about QMB on sanctions precisely because they think they can be outvoted. For instance, Czech position on Israel is not really a mainstream position, including on sanctions and human rights resolutions in Geneva. Rule of law and democracy. Here I would say that Lithuanian and Slovak position until the elections was more aware of importance of rule of law for the future of the EU. There was an emphasis, even as underpinning of the single market. And the Czech position, I would say, is also aware. As a presidency, they were quite, I think, strong on rule of law and conditionality mechanism. And I would try to formulate it as the existing tools are enough. It's a matter of political will to use them, of political will, including here in Berlin or in Paris by the leaders. And maybe a final point would be whether it's constructive to propose a date for a reform and enlargement, as Charles Michel did at the Bled conference. Again, what I heard was clearly no, because it doesn't motivate countries to reform, and it also doesn't give enough time for discussion about the changes and adaptation that we need. And these adaptations should be focused on policies and on the budget, rather than on institutional reform. And I would even say that, because there are some questions I think they will be coming from the candidate countries, there is a question in the air whether candidate countries should be part of this debate about EU reform, because this should be also union prepared for them. And here, and this is my last point, but I think very important one, there is skepticism about opening up this debate to the candidates in some of the Central Eastern member countries. It might be a contradiction, but if you realize that they are only now starting to assess the impact of enlargement, especially of including Ukraine, to their own positions, policies, economies, exactly right. And what happened with the agricultural exports recently, it took many by surprise. But if you realize that this is coming too fast also for these countries, they are neighboring countries with smaller agricultural markets. Of course, if you allow Ukrainian wheat because of Russia bombing all their sort of ports and closing the Black Sea route, of course they are protecting their own agricultural industry sector. And if you have election campaigns where narrow sort of margins decide, of course governments jump on it. So I would still say that it was important that there was a solution, a pragmatic solution, through which allowed Ukraine not to go to WTO with a complaint. But these debates are coming to these countries in Central Eastern Europe as neighboring countries of Ukraine, especially, too fast. They need more time to digest it.
Thank you very much, Milan. A very good compliment to what Konrad said. I would like to zoom in now on two policy fields, or three policy fields. First on rule of law, and then on the budget, decision-making for the budget, as well as QMV. Maybe you could, to also take up a bit this point of treaty change, yes and no. I mean, we do have a rule of law approach already, and where do you see the shortcomings, and where do you think treaty change is in fact necessary? That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, and also thank you, Milan, for having us here, and DGAP for hosting us. Can I make two quick introductory remarks also, and reacting a bit to what you said, Konrad, regarding whether or not we are enlargement ready? I think the Treaty of Lisbon has been in the past stretched to its limits. It has worked, but it was always last minute, not necessarily always with the democratic oversight that we would have liked in the decision-making processes. And looking towards the challenges that lie ahead in this new geopolitical world, but also with climate change, the climate emergency, I think it is fair to say that we cannot keep on muddling through, neither with the challenges ahead nor really with up to 10 more member states. And both issues have been touched upon. I think both QMV and the rule of law are actually quite central to this question, whether or not we need to reform in order to enlarge. And I do not necessarily think that what we propose will change the balance of the European Union so much. Actually, we discussed this a lot, and we decided to go for a very non-disruptive approach to reform. So really stay within the balance that we see in the European Union at the moment, and to improve it, but not really to disturb or rebalance the different institutions that exist, and also not to rebalance the balance between Parliament, governments, and the Commission. That being said, indeed, the rule of law, and we have heard this a few times also from Daniela, is very fundamental to our report. And you have seen perhaps that it has its own chapter, so we decided to indeed make a separate chapter out of it because we thought it was so fundamental that it cannot be one of the many reform chapters, but it should really precede the rest. And this is because for us, the rule of law, yes, it is one of the values on which the EU is founded, but it's also, what Daniela said, a non-negotiable constitutional principle that really underlies the functioning of the European Union. So it's not just abstract, but it really underlies the functioning of the internal market. If we want to have judicial cooperation, recognition of judgments in civil and commercial matters, we need functioning rule of law principles in all member states. We need independent courts in the member states. And of course, the use of the EU budget also presupposes that there's no corruption in the administration. And lastly, we need it for functioning democracies. So for us, the rule of law is really, really central, both when it comes to enlarging, so really a precondition to enter the European Union, but also a condition to be a member of the European Union and to participate in the policies of the EU. And this is also how we came to these circles in our report, these differentiated circles, because we asked ourselves, where is the boundary, or we call it rule of law frontier, where we say that perhaps the adherence or respect for the rule of law principles are less important. And for us, this was really beyond the internal market. So we said even for those countries that do not wish to integrate further, but that wish to participate in the single market, the principles of rule of law are non-negotiable. And we also said this cannot be solved by differentiation. So you cannot have a bit of integration and a bit of rule of law. If there is some sort of integration, there must be the respect for the rule of law. So this was really the premise of how we came to our discussion on the rule of law. We did not propose an exclusion clause. I think this is important. We did not say that if there's no respect for the law, there should be a way to exclude member states, because this would shift the balance too much in how we see the European Union, and also we considered that this would be too much of a punishment for EU citizens. So we did not want to go this far, but we really said that our proposals are meant to provide incentives to member states to go back to the respect of the rule of law and really to adhere to the rule of law, which is why we have the proposals that we have. And Milan, you mentioned that the instruments that we have are sufficient, and it is only about the political will to use them. To an extent, I agree, which is why we actually have it as one recommendation to use the tools that are there. It is an explicit recommendation to use the budgetary conditionality mechanism as it exists. But at the same time, we also know that Article 7 was drafted during a time when it was not meant to be used, and it was not meant to cover a situation where there's several member states under this procedure, right? So we have a procedure written in the treaties that do not match the realities of today anymore, which is why I think we do need to reform this. And Johannes, you asked about treaty change and not treaty change. We have both options. Throughout the report, we actually provide several options or different options in the different areas, some that would require treaty change and some that would not. Our first options for the rule of law are indeed treaty change, to change Article 7, both to depoliticize and make it more functioning again, so the Article 7 procedure itself, which is the procedure whereby member states can, amongst others, be deprived of their voting rights in the Council if they breach EU values, but also to provide a better foundation for the budgetary conditionality mechanism and to expand the scope of it as well, to make it more efficient and to no longer have to so strictly link it to the budget as now also the Court of Justice requires. If there's no treaty change, we make other suggestions in how the conditionality mechanism could be strengthened, and again, we also propose to simply use it. So we really try to provide different options there. And perhaps one last word. For us, it was very clear that the EU cannot function without reciprocity, mutual trust, and really all of the member states adhering to the principle of the rule of law. So, of course, the question is at some point whether or not a member state can still participate in all of the policies if these conditions are not given. And so the instruments really need to be geared towards the question, how can we ensure that member states respect the rule of law? I have a few more comments on QMV, but I think I will leave it to Shahin as a matter of fact.
Then let's go straight. Thank you very much, too, for that clarification and your expose on rule of law. Shahin, maybe you start with QMV, picking up, and then go into the budget decision making. I mean, noting, of course, that what is interesting happened to me as well. Don't worry. Noting, of course, that what is interesting is the distinction between institutional reform of the budget space and the budget itself, and that subtle difference you make nicely in the report, and would be interesting if you could also pick that up. But I leave it to you if you want to start with the budget and then the QMV. It's up to you. But both we would like to hear from you.
Thank you. No, I'll actually start with the QMV because Konrad made very important points about it in his presentation, and it's true, which some rightly ask us. That the QMV is an important part of our report, and I think for two fundamental reasons. The first one is I think we have a slightly more critical assessment about the way the EU functions today and the need for QMV to ensure the capacity to act. There are countless examples of how the EU has been able to do even without QMV and despite the vetoes or despite the threat of vetoes. But I think on the whole, our assessment, the assessment of the group, is that the Union on the whole is way less efficient than it could be and way less efficient than it must be, and that's in large part because of the prevalence of vetoes. I'm saying this also as somebody who has been particularly traumatized by the Euro crisis, and now during the Euro crisis, the use or the threat of vetoes by small and large member states, not to name one in particular in Berlin, has, I think, been a reason why we have had a policy response to the Euro crisis that has been very inadequate in many instances and has costed the EU tremendously. And so I think, this is where we have a divergent opinion to start with on the cost of vetoes or the threat of vetoes and the need for the expansion of QMV. I think the second is more symbolic. And here I would bring you back to the speech that Chancellor Scholz gave in August of 2022, which I think is an important background to our report. And in this speech, the Chancellor did two important things. One is he actually said, making kind of a concession to an historical French view, that deepening of Europe, institutional reform, should take place before enlargement, and in that sense, disagreed with the President of the Commission. But he also said that QMV should be expanded, and in particular in two areas. And he stated tax policy and foreign policy. And there is a very specific reason why he did that. And it's not because these are necessarily the areas where we need it the most. He specifically said that because these are the areas that are symbolically the most important to France and to Germany. And so behind the QMV, beyond the efficiency question, I think there is a symbolic gesture that is very important. And what the Chancellor wanted to do with that speech is to say, if France can make a step in the direction of QMV on foreign policy, which is something that is highly symbolic and important in France, and if Germany can do the same on tax policy, which is equally symbolic in Germany, then we will show to the rest of Europe that if both countries can make a step and make a sacrifice in the name of Europe, then every other country in the EU should be able to make an equivalent sacrifice in the name of Europe. And I'm saying that, and that's a segue to the budget discussion, because I think we have to be clear that the enlargement is not free. And it's not free in political terms, and it's not free in financial terms. It's not free in political terms because we think it has to come with some sacrifice on the decision-making process. And it's not free in financial terms because everybody has to realize that enlarging will cost money. And it probably will cost even more money, and I think this is going to be important, to those countries that are today are the largest net recipient from the EU budget. And I think that's something to understand. And so I think this is important because what we must realize, in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, which has since the enlargement benefited greatly from the EU budget, that this enlargement is going to cost them potentially disproportionately so. And so for the EU budget, where what we are concluding is that it was already difficult enough to agree on MFF, with 27 vetoes, and that the cost of that was very often that we generally overweighted in the EU budget policies that were essentially just a transfer machine between member states, and underweighted policies that were providing true public goods in the name of the EU. In the future, we believe that if we want to have a more efficient EU, we need to keep funding public goods, and that keeping funding public goods and maybe enlarging the range of public goods we're funding with the EU budget will require more money. And then when it comes to the policies that are more transfer-like, and I'm thinking of the common agricultural policy in particular, there will clearly have to be sacrifices. And what we think is that these sacrifices are not possible under a 27-member state veto, and will be even less so in the future. And so what we propose is essentially two things, that basically the spending of the budget will be decided under qualified majority. The resources of the EU budget, which are still predominantly national resources in the absence of a large share of own resources, will still be decided under unanimity. So member states would keep a strong weight in deciding how much, what is the size of the EU budget, but reforming the EU budget itself and allowing the spending, that would be done under QMV. And we hope that this would also facilitate another discussion, which is very much linked to the evolution of the EU budget, which is the ability to borrow. Right now, the ability to borrow has been created under an emergency legal basis during COVID. What we believe is that this should be made easier, potentially under something else than an emergency legal basis. So these are big breakthroughs. And to end with the symbol, our message was, if you are not prepared to move and make a sacrifice on QMV, and if you're not prepared to make a move and make a sacrifice on the EU budget, then probably you're not prepared for enlargement.
Thank you, Shahin. Thanks also for explaining really the rationale on the budget, because I think that's one of the chapters that is yet under-scrutinized by people picking up on the report. I'm very conscious of the fact that we have half an hour left, and I would like to open up as well to the audience here and also to the Zoom questions that we have. What I would suggest now is maybe, Konrad, you could react from your side, maybe also both on, I know you wanted to particularly take up the rule of law question, but also a bit segueing into the point on process, how you see the next steps in this debate. And then I would also like to turn to my right again and give Daniela the floor, maybe more of the focus also a bit on the reception of the process subsequently, and then for Milan as well, so Konrad. But if we could keep it a bit shorter, mindful that here are experts sitting in the audience that would probably want to raise their voice as well. Thank you.
It's not very easy to keep it very short because it's complex, but I will do my best. On rule of law, without the context and without the experience of last year, I would say I agree with the previous intervention on the gravity and importance of the rule of law as a value paradigm, something which unites us and create a base for everything we do. But we have a context and we have an experience. So I would like to stress one principal thing. The rule of law is, of course, the value of Polish constitution. It's equally important as the value of treaties, and no controversy about it. Where controversy lies is a specific translation of this paradigm into very detailed recommendations, sometimes even judgments, on internal organization of the judiciary in one member state. And of course, again, it's very complex. And we have no time to present all the complexity of this, but I would like to stress the two different things. The gravity of value, no controversy, and controversy over the competence, over the specific recommendation of different institutions in case of Poland. From this perspective, the transformation of the mechanism of protection of the EU budget into something general, in fact, the general instrument to protect not only rule of law, but all values presented in the Article 2 of the treaty, is exactly the concept rejected very strongly and openly by the European Court of Justice, and rightly so. I don't have time to present all detailed argumentation behind this, but it is a very solid argument to say that we have a European Court of Justice to say what is in line and what is not in line with the treaty. And we can't substitute the European Court of Justice with a political process, with sanctions on political demand made by ministers with initiative of the European Commission, administrative body. To be honest, it's hard to find a better example. This is not separated example, but it's very clear example how protection of rule of law can lead us all to the abuse of rule of law principle, where legal certainty and right to court is of crucial importance. So I would warn you not to go this way because, as I said, it is rejected by the European Court of Justice, but it is also rejected by the European Council with these recommendations. It was rejected also by the European Commission because the European Commission decided to apply, from their perspective, autonomously, of course, the same rules, and Court of Auditors said the same. The only institutions would like to politicize, hyper-politicize the whole mechanism and to make this mechanism a punitive mechanism of sanctions internally is the European Parliament, of course. But I'm not sure if it's a good ally for a credible reform perspective for all member states. I'm afraid it's just opposite. On QMV and budgetary aspects, I would agree that the fiscal aspect of enlargement is one of the most important, because at the moment, especially now, after the Secretary General presented some estimations, our attention across the continent is totally absorbed by the fact that it is expensive. And this is totally trap. It's a blind ally. We will not defend the enlargement if we will concentrate and we will repeat that it's expensive, expensive, expensive. Because enlargement, and not only in geopolitical sense, but in trade, economic sense, is an investment. And the previous enlargement are very clear. Of course, it costs something. We are still dealing with 1% GDP budget. It's not huge, I would say. But these investments are coming back to our capitals, like Berlin, the most competitive capitals in Europe, coming back, I don't know, 8 times, 10 times more in trade integration. Poland is also beneficial because of funds. Funds accelerate the process of modernization. It's a valuable aspect. But the most important part of Polish success is trade, proper trade integration with the European Union, thanks to the internal market. And we have to present this perspective, because otherwise populists will say that it's simply too much. Probably for many of them, even 1 billion would be too much, because we have NHS, let's say. In every single country, we have so-called NHS. So I wouldn't go this way. It's a simply trap. On QMV, Central Europe is not, in this sense, in fiscal and tax, it's not the best partner to discuss. I'm not sure if we can defend QMV on tax and fiscal in many other capitals first. Ask yourself if you really want, if you're really able to defend QMV on tax and fiscal in Bundestag. And I'm not talking about this Bundestag or another, in any Bundestag. I'm not sure. Go to The Hague, to Helsinki, to Stockholm, and ask them if it's right to do it. I'm not very sure. On QMV, on spending, it's another side of the same coin. You will alienate Central Europe and probably solve. So I know the tragedy of MFF negotiations. I spent more than 2 years talking about the last MFF, but I'm afraid we have no alternative, because with this sort of process, we secure the interest of every single capital and at least minimal standard that we can defend it in the end to ratify the MFF in every capital. And we need ratification in the majority of countries. So we should be very careful, because with this plan...
Just on this, so you're confident that in a union of 36 members, we will be able to pass an MFF with 36 vetoes?
Yes, we have no alternative. There will be a screaming, there will be a long-term, ugly discussion, and in the end, of course, in the middle of the night, because otherwise it's unimportant, in the middle of the night, we will have something like MFF. Of course, it's another question. If we really can live, even without enlargement, with the 1% GDP, it's another question. Because we have, for example, clean tech financial challenges vis-a-vis US and other bigger capitals. And we have to ask ourselves if it's feasible to make a union like this with 1%. But it's another story. It's not related to enlargement. I'm afraid that the plan of QMV on fiscal and QMV on spending would lead us to the EU4 or EU5, not EU30 plus. Because you would alienate, one by one, majority of capitals with this sort of proposal, because it is simply out of the political context. And we have to live with this.
I'm afraid I need to stop you here and turn...
Okay.
But thank you very much. And then turn now over to Daniela. I mean, we've heard also the very diverse views that exist, and both on the issue of treaty change, institutional reform, and enlargement. I mean, in the report, of course, you offer, as Tu has already explained, different options, which in a way allows also for in a way the European Council as well as the EU institution to choose. But how do you see the sort of next steps in this process?
Thank you. Well, right now, I think, well, this was just a spotlight on a few positions. There are many more out there. But I found it fascinating. The two rapporteurs of our group were invited twice to the General Affairs Council. And in May, the situation was pretty much, you know, distanced to the fact that this group exists, questions why, and definitely no positions put forward by the representatives of national governments. And then we came back in September, and the report was given to them beforehand, and that was a really substantive discussion, which was a very positive signal, because the mere link between enlargement and the need to change the EU as we now know it, that in a way was accepted. And of course there were governments that said no treaty change, Lisbon is enlargement proof, and there were others that said let's look into this first, we don't take a position here now on treaty change or not, but we don't exclude it. There were of course discussions about the question, do we just look at efficiency? Do we look at democratic legitimacy as well? And no one really contested the rule of law issue in that context, that it is something that is the basis of the European Union.
Me too.
Sorry?
Including me.
Yes, you said that very clearly. Yes, absolutely.
Somewhere deeper.
That is true. But what we see now, I think, is a need by December for the 27 to make up their minds how they see the process of enlargement going forward, important decisions to be made on Ukraine, Moldova, maybe on other candidates that are already negotiating. I think it would be hugely important to send a very strong political signal. In our view as a group, the signal should be twofold. One is we want to be credible on enlargement, and we want to be very concrete about how we think about the next steps to strengthen the EU. In the report, you find short-term measures, which we thought through really in the horizon, some of them even before the European elections, because there is a high risk that after the European elections, the political situation will be more difficult. 2024 is an election year in 7 EU member states, and there is potentially a time of, let's say, political paralysis after the elections if there are difficult decision-making processes going on the next leadership, where we also have our proposals to make, how we say, let's keep this as short as possible, please pre-commit to certain decisions based on certain results. So I do think December is really crucial, and the political window now is open, and the message has to go both ways. One, to the EU, we need to get ready, but the other one to the countries, in particular those that have been negotiating for a long time, to think hard whether they can remobilize their own process. Because if we look at some of the Western Balkan countries, we don't see progress, and we are blamed for not delivering progress on the EU side, and that needs to be overcome from both sides. Just one comment on the 2030 date. The 2030 date, as we put it into the report, is not a date for enlargement to happen, but it should be a self-commitment by the European Union to say, by then, we will have our internal problems solved. Mm-hmm. On the budget, just one word, because you said this hasn't been discussed that much. That is absolutely true, and it's just a very short chapter, because it wasn't really in our mandate. And then we said, okay, but we can take an angle which is on the decision-making and on, you know, the general political relevance to look at the question, and then we do make some proposals. I feel that after the first round of reactions, this is now pushing in, and this is what has happened in the general European debate. When this group was installed, the focus was indeed on institutional reform. Since then, the focus has shifted to policy reform and budget questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Milan, very, very short, and then I open up.
I'm aware of time, so I want to come back to the process. Because the first reaction when I made my phone calls in the 3 capitals was, or their diplomats here, was puzzlement about the report and the process. And I just want to sort of put it into our discussion that these officials said, look, back in January, we were asked to nominate our own experts to maybe a larger expert group on EU reform. We did, then nothing. Now, how can we enter this debate except at the level of GAC? It's rushed. It's very fragile, it's very important, but there is a feeling that it's rushed. And one government official asked me, so we made our internal position. Where can we publish it? Where can we put it? So there is there has been internal deliberation inside government. So the report initiative was useful for that, but there is no public debate. There is no public discourse about it. Although there are experts like us, you know, our peers in Prague, Bratislava, Vilnius that are eager to engage. And they are even talking to their own governments, but they are not part of this process. So I want to shout out one nice paper put together by Vilnius University's Institute of International Relations and Political Science. Based on their debate on 12th of June, they invited experts from Poland, Nordic countries, and they put together a paper that is focused on enlargement, how to actually get to enlargement when we don't have enlargement, functioning enlargement accession model. And there are interesting things. They suggest constructive abstention rather than vetoes. But I think we have two elephants in the room, at least, in this debate.
Good.
And can I just point them out? So
no, Milan. I stop you here because otherwise we don't. But Daniela, you wanted to just say that.
Just one comment on the European dimension, because I think the point Milan made is very important. So first of all, we were a Franco-German group, but our mandate already said we should engage with other Europeans, and we took that extremely seriously. So we spent a lot of extra hours in calls with think tankers, decision makers from EU countries, but also from accession countries or future candidate countries. So we really enlarged that group. And I also wish to point out that there was a Lithuanian initiative, which wasn't just Lithuanian, but it came out of Lithuania, which also led to a report which was actually discussed in an informal General Affairs Council dinner before we presented our report. And I think that is very important because there are now others put themselves to work and actually delivered at the same moment. So it's by far no longer a debate which we in any way dominate. I don't think so. We delivered something and others deliver things too. Some of them focus more on enlargement, others focus more on institutional reform. I think the next step will be the policy debate, which is crucial. But I also am impressed by the way media have picked up on the issue. So I do think there is a public debate. I can just say that we had an enormous press attention, and very often in the pieces the report is looked at, but there are also other voices quoted, and we have been invited to parliaments, and I think this is now happening around the EU.
Very good. Now, speaking of debate, I would like to open up the debate and give the floor to the Hausherr. Guntram, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the great debate, thank you in particular to you also, Konrad Szymański, for coming here. It's great to see you here again. I have 3 quick points. I mean, the first is about this issue of unanimity on the budget. I tend to agree with Konrad Szymański that this is actually a very big ask to give that up. And Shahin, when you mention the Eurozone crisis, I guess it's not exactly advertisement in Berlin to say, well, we would have been much better if only Germany couldn't have blocked Eurobonds or something of that sort. And even though, of course, content-wise, you have a point that we do need to move on these issues. So I guess the first question is, don't we need to think much more strongly in terms of grand bargain? Right? I mean, so grand bargain, not just foreign policy, budget policy, but really security policy, defense policy, budget policy. So that's the first. The second, just to second the issue on the rule of law, I totally agree with the report that the rule of law cannot be negotiable. I mean, this is the basis of the European Union construction. And we are currently in a situation where it is severely in danger, and the non-application of Article 7 is a big issue, and we need to solve it. And especially if we think about enlarging the European Union to countries, many countries, including countries on the Balkans and Ukraine, of course, this issue will become much bigger. So I think we need to solve this, and so I would very much support the report there. The third point is really then my main question to all of you. I mean, all of this sounds extremely difficult and unlikely to get through. So what's the plan? What's the plan B? I mean, don't we need to start a much more sort of offensive and clear debate on multi-speed Europe with different degrees of integration, with a smaller core and an outer layer that is more loosely associated? I mean, shouldn't that in the end be the debate? Thank you.
I would take in one further question. I mean, the differentiation question, thank you, Guntram, is also raised in the chat, so there's a nice parallel. That's good. If I could ask the microphone to be passed on.
I would like to address the question of QMD. I have a certain advantage over all of you. I was for 6.5 years permanent representative in Brussels, and I had to apply QMD as well as unanimity. Mm-hmm. And I had to suffer from both consequences of both. And I would like to remind you, the practice in Brussels, even on question where QMD is applicable, is not to force through a vote. You negotiate as long as acceptable in order to bring about a compromise with everybody, to take each member state along. And that is in the interest of each member state, because each member state could come in a situation where, thanks to QMD, that state could be outvoted. So we all spend days and nights to please everybody. But in the end, we must have a compromise. And such a compromise requires the possibility that a member state can be outvoted if not enough willingness to compromise is offered. So, without QMD, you are ending up at the mercy of hardliners who don't want, for whatever valid internal reasons, not to accept the notion of compromise, which is the only notion that keeps the European Union together. Who is not willing to compromise cannot be a European member state of any union, except an alliance of the kind before World War I or II, which, as we all know, in particular, when we are Germans and Poles, have brought us where we got. So I simply plead to more practicability and not this fundamentalism. And one last observation, it's all also a question. This fiscal business. We have always, as Germans, insisted on unanimity on these questions. What was the result? Endless negotiations, and we paid each time more, and much more than we wanted. Why? Because otherwise the European Union would not have functioned. And it would have been not in the German interest to have a union that doesn't function. That, for instance, I negotiated this, participated in the negotiation to deal on the financial package to allow Poland to join. And we were squeezed by our partners, and we spent, because we wanted, excuse me, Poland in. And this is something I would like to remind you in this whole debate, which sounds to me too bureaucratic and technocratic.
Herr von Kio, thank you very much for this intervention. I would like to now pick up these points and also what Guntram said. And maybe we could start from this side, and you could react to, in particular, the budgetary points. And then maybe you could pick up also the point on differentiation. And then the grand bargain.
Yeah, so completely agree with the points raised by Guntram about the notion of a grand bargain. In fact, in the report, we clearly enlarged the discussion beyond QMV on tax and foreign policy to a much broader range, precisely because we think, touching on several issues would allow to bring more countries around the table and to get to that grand bargain. So we, for instance, say, doing QMV on foreign policy, but keeping defense issues under unanimity doesn't make much sense because you don't really have a foreign policy if you don't have a defense policy. So we try to put that grand bargain together. On fiscal issues, I mean, you kind of have responded to Guntram. You know, you're right, it's not very popular in Berlin to talk about QMV on fiscal issues, and at the same time, even under unanimity, at the end of the day, Germany ended up paying. But still inflicting a huge cost by, you know, paying too little and too late. You know, had we done the ESM the first day, or had we done actually an EU-funded mechanism on the first day, this would have costed less to Germany and less to Greece at the end of the day. So, you know, all of that to say that unanimity sounds nice on paper, but at the end of the day, it's costing everybody a lot much more. And I'll just end with that.
Thank you. Then I would quickly pick up on the differentiation part. We also discussed this a lot. As a matter of fact, what do we do if there's no agreement on reforms? And we proposed to adopt reforms via supplementary treaty, for example. And we also provide different options for opt-outs. And this is why we have these different circuits, both for rule of law reasons, but also for this question of how do we integrate deeper if not everyone is on board. And I think I can say that this has also been picked up quite in the debate, the circuit we have in the discussion on differentiated integration, how does that work, and where this will lead. And I think you're very right that this is an important topic. And since I am on the treaty reform question, can I answer one of the questions above? Because there's one question asking, shouldn't the EU reform itself softly through some adaptations via ratification of accession treaties? And this is also one of the options that we provide in the report, so really the way on how to get to treaty change. And this is an option, but there are limits to it. So, of course, if you go via this route, then the reforms must be linked to accession in a way that it would still fall under this option. So it is one option, but with limits and also limits regarding the transparency of the discussions, because we have also talked about the citizens' involvement. But of course, this is one option.
Maybe on both the fear of differentiation as a reaction towards difficult negotiations, and also your vision on a grand bargain, given that evidently there are different views on many of these issues.
I think if the differentiation, as it is called in the report, would be such an easy solution, we would have it already in practice. And we have some aspects of differentiation everywhere where it doesn't hurt the integrity of the Union itself. Because we have European political community. What is more important, we have a different architecture of our trade policy and association policy, which is, let's say, political context for intensive trade relations, like in case of Ukraine. And we can live with this because it doesn't hurt the integrity of the Union. Every time we go to the moment where the integrity is at stake, I would warn you. Not as a commentator from a country which would specifically fear, but as someone who would like to see Union coherent and strong in the world. The fact that Europe is important and relevant from the regulatory point of view, from trade point of view, is the fact that Europe is big enough, that our custom union and our internal market represent up to 500 million wealthy citizens, taxpayers, and people. And that's why it is important that if we will agree, for example, on privacy standards in digital era, it will be something important on the other side of the Atlantic. If we would have a union of the six, then the variety of choices, alternatives would be much, much bigger. And I wouldn't like to see Europe as an irrelevant partner who would maybe can create even more sophisticated common denominator on many, many issues, but would be irrelevant from the point of view what is most important today, the global competition. And the scale of the union is important. So we can talk and we can create all sorts of specific solutions, as stability mechanism mentioned by Günther. But we should be very, very careful, because one day we can break the integrity of the market, and then the world will understand that this organization is not relevant anymore, so we don't need to pay attention. They will be happy, and we will be, in the end, not very happy with this. So I can talk about any scenario, but I will strongly defend the question of custom union, the integrity of the market, of course, in the wider sense. I'm not talking about the shallow trade perspective. It's also including this whole package of regulatory heritage of union and regulatory power of union. It's of course unprecedented. This is something important. Without scale, we will be irrelevant. If differentiation would address the problems which are not so meaningful, then the whole differentiation wouldn't be meaningful as well. So I think that we have a squaring the circle here, and there are limits where we can find fair solutions. And the limit is the scale of the union and the global stage.
And I mean, you're not anymore minister, so you're a commentator now, deputy director of a research institute. Where do you see the grand bargain?
First of all, I would strongly suggest not to use this bargain or even blackmail institution reform versus enlargement. I think it's a trap for all of us. I fully believe, I trust that we all believe that the enlargement is good for Europe, and we should do it because of many, many reasons. So I think we shouldn't play too much with this argument, because one day this argument will come back to us, and it will be an uncomfortable situation. So first of all, the second question, I think we should pay much more attention, not just as a zero-sum game, but much more attention to the question of ownership of the political process. The reasons behind Brexit, whatever we think about proportionality of this move, I'm not very happy with Brexit, I would say. But the reason behind, this strong emotion behind Brexit was undefined feeling of uncontrol. And it can happen in every single corner of Europe. This is not a separated issue. The problem of decreasing trust to public institutions, decreasing trust to mainstream politics, decreasing trust to each other in the society is a problem for every single society in European Union, and it can damage the process of hyperconnectivity, codependency we like so much. I'm pretty sure that this codependency is important, and we should protect it. Playing with QMV, playing with all sorts of maybe efficient but risky institutional solutions means that we add arguments to those who would like to manifest that they are not first-class citizens anymore, and they should challenge this process, because this is super globalized process governed by someone we even don't know. This is a real risk, and here I would say here we have much more important challenges, all of us, than the efficiency of the decision-making process in the Union. It will be like this forever, because we live in a continent which is very rich in terms of historical heritage, historical sensitivity. We all have our own way of thinking about the world, and we will not change it. And QMV, in essence, from the philosophical political perspective, is a sort of redistribution of power. It's an agreement that, yes, we can agree that someone else will decide about our own future. And we are talking about organization which is not happy with the redistribution of 1% of the GDP budget. So we are not there yet, at least not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, just to add that, of course, QMV is the dominating decision-making process.
Yes,
so it is for the ordinary procedure is done under QMV. We took that decision at the latest when we built the single market in the Single European Act, and that was an important, as Ambassador von Kier has reminded us, an important decision. So I think some of the criticism on QMV has to, on both sides. I mean, you have to, Shahin and Daniela, you've made the case for the specific policy areas, but not forget that, of course, already we have QMV on quite a lot of regulation in the ordinary process. I'm very conscious of the time, and the colleagues have made me have given signals that we're already over time, but I would like to nevertheless give you, Daniela, Milan, the opportunity to do a quick closing words if you want. Milan?
Sure, and then we can take even more questions, hopefully, or people are also thinking about the food that didn't arrive before we started. But so as a closing word, to answer Guntram's question about differentiated integration and how to get there, I think that's heart of the matter. So there are discussions in some capitals of Central Eastern Europe about this, imagining different level of memberships. Membership is important. I would group them in so these countries in the category that there are some that would say status quo plus in an incremental way. Maybe there is even a reform enthusiast, maybe Slovenia, I don't know, but you can have that. And then there are those who would say status quo minus. And I think this will not change. So Hungary is clearly in the camp of status quo minus. They have a prime minister who plans to be in power still when we enlarge, if 2030 or whatever. He plans to be in power for long. And he says, the moment Hungary becomes a net payer, it's a different game for us. And we want loser integration. So this will not go away from us. It's there. It's part of the sort of day-to-day business because their calculation about vetoes is then different. You know, they have learned to be very transactional and they don't care if this is slow and ineffective. Here, I would understand Hungarian position on the discussion about future of the European Union quite tough and tougher than the Polish position. I still think that having this discussion is low-hanging fruit in capitals of Central Eastern Europe. You can bring it there. It's important. And then other elephant in the room would be the fact that the impact of Ukraine on enlargement and on their net positions is enormous. It's enormous. The enlargement is becoming Ukraine-focused compared to all Balkan candidates together. The impact is enormous. And again, they need time. And maybe my final point would be that with rule of law focus, also something that you have diverging positions in Central Eastern Europe, we have to accept that this treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, allows illiberal democracy to be part of the EU and to be respected as a member state. You can perfectly be a member state, and even the rule of law conditionality mechanism that was applied slow down the recovery funding for Hungary for 2 years. Have you noticed the compromise about the money for Ukraine from a few days ago? Hungary will get 13 billion euros from recovery fund, just slow, and there is the deadline. So it's much more nuanced and complicated, but we have to discuss it all together. And I think the biggest problem is that we have, and not only because of Central Eastern Europe, sometimes we are scapegoats. Because of what's happening with our societies and our political dynamics in member states, we have politically diverging EU, already sort of system that is difficult to function, and we will have more of that because there are elections also in other countries, Netherlands and so on and so on. It will be much more difficult to operate the system, not because of Poland and Hungary, which make it difficult, but because the system is heavy and we are more divided in capitals.
Thank you. Thank you, Milan, not only for your concluding words, but also for having had the idea and taken the initiative to bring us all together. And thank you to Konrad Szymański for having accepted the invitation. I think the past 1.5 hours really showed us how important this discussion is and how much more of discussions we will need to reach a common ground. I did take note that indeed, Konrad, you questioned some of the elements that the EU is today in what you said. That makes it even more complicated. But I do think that we are facing a situation where we will be pushed to act on the future of both enlargement and the European Union. And I also believe that we will have a more differentiated European Union. What we, I think, have to bear in mind is that this should not be differentiation at any price, but really an attempt to enhance our capacity to act together within the EU institutional framework. And that is maybe one of the conclusions we didn't that much share of our group work, is that we did acknowledge, in contrast to others who speak easily of letting go of the Brussels system or refounding the EU in one way or another, we were convinced, and we are today, that we do need, as member states, we need the institutions in Brussels to help decision-making, to support decision-making, to enable the member states to forge compromise. So with those words, I'm looking forward to further debates, and thanks also to you, Johannes, for your chairing of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was fundamental and very nice concluding remarks. Nothing more for me to add than to thank you in the audience for being here and the panelists, and I'm sure we will continue to debate this very important topic. So thank you very much. Have a good weekend and see you soon. Bye-bye.